The engine had barely cooled when Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer noticed the swing set. It stood where the cedar line used to be. He remained seated in his truck for a moment, one hand still resting on the steering wheel, watching children run across bright green turf that hadn't existed 9 months ago. A blue shade canopy stretched over picnic tables. A paved walking loop curved along the creek bank his father once spent entire summers stabilizing by hand. Families laughed. Dogs barked. Someone tossed a frisbee across open grass. Daniel stepped out slowly. His boots sank into soft rubber mulch instead of dirt. At the entrance, a wooden sign read, Willow Creek Community Park. Maintained by Willow Creek HOA. He didn't react outwardly. No anger. No raised voice. He simply walked to the corner post near the gate, a rusted iron survey pin set in concrete. He brushed dirt from the top with his thumb. The cap was still stamped with the original county marking. Still inside his boundary. A woman pushing a stroller smiled politely. Nice, right? HOA finally put this in used land to good purpose. Daniel nodded once, eyes moving across the fencing, the drainage pipe rerouted toward the creek, the anchored playground posts sunk deep into soil he knew layer by layer. He opened the back of his truck and removed the long withered map tube. Unrolled a survey across the hood. Looked at the coordinates. Looked back at the park. Then quietly said, almost to himself, permanent structures, inside a recorded private parcel. He rolled the survey back up carefully and asked under his breath, who approved building a public park on land the county never transferred? If you believe problems should be solved with proof, not volume, consider subscribing. Stories like this aren't about revenge. They're about patience, records, and the moment the truth finally reaches the right desk. Daniel Mercer wasn't the kind of person who rushed into confrontation. Years as an Army geospatial engineer taught him that arguments rarely solved anything, measurements did. Coordinates didn't care about opinions. Paperwork didn't respond to emotion. If something was wrong, the answer existed somewhere in records, stamps, and signatures. The small property outside Willow Creek subdivision had been his father's retirement project. Just under 6 acres bordering a shallow creek that flooded every spring before his father spent years reinforcing the bank with rock and drainage grading. It wasn't expensive land, but it was precise land. His father had insisted on a professional survey after every nearby development phase. Daniel grew up watching orange tripods and measuring rods more often than toys. When his father passed, the documents came with the house, carefully labeled folders going back decades. County confirmations, easement adjustments from road widening, flood control correspondence, and multiple boundary verifications. His father trusted records more than memory. Willow Creek subdivision arrived slowly. First a dozen homes. Then streets. Then the HOA. The president, Caroline Pike, introduced herself the week Daniel moved back in after inheriting the property. She was organized, friendly, and spoke with the steady confidence of someone used to people agreeing with her. At first it was small things. A letter suggesting he remove an older storage shed for neighborhood consistency. He replied politely that it sat outside the subdivision boundary. A request asking permission to place decorative trail markers near the creek edge. He declined, attaching a parcel map. The responses were always courteous, but shorter each time. Months later, a neighborhood newsletter mentioned future greenbelt expansion. No details, just a concept image showing a walking path near water that looked vaguely familiar. Daniel drafted a clarification email explaining that the creek section was a privately recorded parcel, not part of community land. He included a plat reference number. No one responded. 2 weeks later he received deployment orders overseas. Before leaving, he walked the back acreage once more, habit, not concern, checking fence corners and the old survey monument his father insisted never be disturbed. Everything was normal. Quiet. The kind of quiet that made change obvious when it finally arrived. The park hadn't been built gradually. It appeared finished. Daniel returned just after sunrise the morning following his arrival, carrying only a tape measure and his phone. Morning fog still sat low over the creek, and for a brief second, from a distance, the scene almost looked temporary, like event equipment left overnight. But up close, nothing about it was temporary. Concrete footings anchored the playground posts. A drainage trench had been cut along the bank and lined with gravel. Solar lighting poles were buried deep enough to require excavation permits. He walked the outer edge first, staying outside the fence. Every few yards he stopped, measured from the old barbed wire corner stakes, and compared the distance to the parcel map on his screen. Each reading placed the fence several feet inside his land. At the creek crossing he paused longer. The soil had been reshaped, graded to redirect runoff away from the subdivision and toward the lower bend of the water channel. Efficient work. Professional work. But done without contacting the recorded owner. A man jogging the track slowed beside him. Pretty great improvement, huh? HOA said the county finally approved using the vacant lot. Daniel nodded once. Did they say when that happened? Few months back, I think. They had contractors out here all summer. All summer. While he'd been overseas. Daniel checked the county property portal again. Parcel number unchanged. Tax responsibility unchanged. No transfer, no easement filing, no condemnation record. That evening he opened his mailbox. Among advertisements sat a white envelope stamped with the HOA seal. Notice of owner responsibility, common area maintenance assessment. It listed his parcel ID. Below it, a balance owed for landscaping upkeep of the newly constructed park. For a moment he simply stood in the kitchen holding the letter. Not disbelief. Not anger. Just calculation. He placed the notice on the table, then walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a plastic storage bin labeled in his father's handwriting. Surveys, do not discard. He set it beside the letter and quietly began sorting papers into chronological order. Daniel didn't go to the HOA office. He didn't knock on Caroline Pike's door or post in the neighborhood group. Instead, he mailed a certified letter. It was short, a single page requesting copies of any permits, ownership transfers, easements, or legal authority used to construct permanent structures on Parcel 18B. He attached the parcel number, the plat reference, and a copy of his most recent tax statement. 3 days later the delivery receipt returned signed. 5 days after that, a response arrived, not from the HOA board, but from an attorney. The letter didn't provide documents. It provided language. It referenced Community Improvement Authority and good faith development of unused adjacent land. It suggested that because the property had been visually integrated into the subdivision and unmaintained during owner absence, the association acted within reasonable interpretation of shared use expectations. Daniel read it twice. Then once more. He placed it into a new folder labeled Correspondence and drove to the county clerk's office. The clerk recognized the parcel number quickly. She pulled the file, sliding stamped pages across the counter. No dedication. No acquisition filing. No right-of-way adjustment. No petition for eminent domain. The parcel still belonged entirely to him. Look straightforward, she said casually. Probably a civil misunderstanding. Daniel nodded politely and asked for certified copies anyway. 2 days later a zoning compliance officer visited the site after receiving his inquiry. The officer measured distances, took photographs, and left a door tag stating the matter appeared to be a private property dispute outside immediate enforcement. The HOA interpreted that as confirmation. Flyers appeared on mailboxes announcing a grand opening ribbon ceremony for Willow Creek Community Park, celebrating neighborhood cooperation. Daniel attended. He stood near the back of the small crowd, hands folded, listening as Caroline Pike thanked residents for supporting the reclamation of neglected land into shared value. No one noticed him until after the ribbon was cut. A board member approached politely. "You must be glad it's finally useful space." Daniel answered evenly. "I'm still waiting to see the authorization paperwork." The man's smile tightened slightly. Our legal team handled it. Daniel nodded once and said nothing else. Over the next week he visited the park daily, not entering, only walking the perimeter. Each time he photographed boundary markers, fencing alignment, and lighting installations. A patrol officer eventually stopped beside him one afternoon. HOA reported you might be attempting vandalism. Daniel showed his ID and calmly explained he was documenting his own parcel. The officer looked at the markers, then at the fence line. You two should probably sort this out in court, he said neutrally before leaving. Daniel agreed. But he hadn't filed anything yet. Not because he was uncertain. Because the HOA was still operating under the assumption this was a disagreement. And he was beginning to suspect it wasn't. Within a week, the tone in the neighborhood changed. A post appeared in the Willow Creek residents group, carefully worded, not naming Daniel directly but obvious enough. Certain individuals are attempting to interfere with community amenities enjoyed by families. The board is reviewing legal options to prevent disruption. Comments followed quickly. Some asked what was happening. Others assumed the worst. By the next evening, Daniel's house appeared in a photo online, taken from the sidewalk, captioned "Owner Disputing Children's Park." He didn't respond. Instead, he continued documenting. Every morning before work he walked the fence line with a small field notebook, marking distances between each corner stake and new installation. Every evening he logged dates, lighting activation times, and sprinkler runoff patterns now flowing toward the creek bank his father once stabilized. 3 days later a violation notice appeared on his door. Interference with common area operations. It warned that continued monitoring behavior causing resident discomfort could result in fines. Daniel placed the notice into the correspondence folder without comment. 2 days after that, contractors arrived and installed additional benches, their anchors drilled deeper than the earlier playground posts. He photographed the excavation depth and the disturbed soil layers. He also hired a licensed independent surveyor. The survey took 2 full days. When the markers were re-established, every measurement matched the older records within fractions of an inch. The entire park, not just portions, sat fully within his recorded parcel boundary. The surveyor handed him the stamped report. "You've got a very clear case," he said. "This is an overlap. They either misread the plat or never checked it." Daniel thanked him and made certified copies. While reviewing county planning records that evening, he noticed something unusual, a meeting agenda months earlier referencing a proposed green space dedication area. Attached was a conceptual drawing, not a legal survey, showing the creek zone shaded as future community property. No follow-up approval existed. No signed owner dedication. Just a proposal. The next morning he drove to the planning office to confirm. The clerk scanned the archive and frowned. They never submitted final acquisition documents. Meaning the board had presented a concept as if it were ownership. Daniel didn't contact the HOA. Didn't threaten legal action. He simply organized a second folder labeled planning submissions and placed the conceptual map inside. For the first time since returning home, his expression changed slightly. Not frustration. Recognition. Because the problem was no longer about mistaken boundaries. It was about construction that should never have begun, under authority that had never actually existed. That night the house felt louder than the park ever had. Not from outside, from memory. Daniel sat in a small workshop behind the garage, the one room he hadn't changed since his father passed. Tools still hung in labeled outlines on the wall. A faded measuring tape rested on the workbench, curled exactly where it had been left years earlier. He turned it in his hands without measuring anything. On the table beside him were 2 stacks, the survey reports, and a printed photo taken earlier that afternoon. A child's birthday banner tied to the park fence. Balloons drifting over ground he knew down to the inch. He could end it quickly. File an injunction. Have the county close access within days. Legally, it would be simple now. But it wouldn't be simple for the families who believed they were allowed to be there. He remembered his father repairing downed lines after storms, people shouting at him to restore power faster, even when wires still sparked in standing water. Rushing fixes creates bigger problems, his father always said. Do it right so it stays fixed. Daniel leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling in from travel, paperwork, and the quiet weight of responsibility he hadn't asked for. Part of him wanted to put up a fence immediately and let the argument explode. End the pressure, the rumors, the accusations. But another part understood something deeper. If he forced a confrontation now, the issue would stay personal. Owner versus neighborhood. Instead, he needed the truth to come from someone no one could argue with. Not him. Authority. He closed the folder gently. Because this wasn't just about reclaiming land anymore. It was about making sure the same mistake could never be repeated, to him or anyone else, simply because someone was absent long enough for others to assume permission. So he waited one more day before filing anything. Long enough to make the outcome permanent. 2 mornings later, Daniel received a call from a number he didn't recognize. The woman on the line introduced herself as Marion Keller, retired county planning technician. She said she'd seen his records request come through the office and remembered something about the Willow Creek proposal months earlier. They presented that park as a follow-up submission, she explained. But the board meeting never approved ownership, only the idea. Daniel asked her to clarify. Marion described the hearing. The HOA submitted a presentation map showing the creek area shaded as future community green space. The planning committee believed the association already had permission from the owner and only needed confirmation the layout met zoning guidelines. It wasn't an approval to build, she said carefully. It was approval of a concept, assuming acquisition paperwork would follow. Daniel looked at the conceptual drawing he'd printed the night before. There was no survey seal. No bearings. No distances. Just a colored outline. Marion continued, almost apologetically. Someone later filed the meeting minutes as if it were authorization. The language was vague enough that contractors might think construction was cleared. Meaning the HOA didn't ignore a denial. They treated a presentation as permission. Daniel thanked her and ended the call. He compared the conceptual map to the stamped survey report. The park structures didn't just sit on his land. They were placed using boundaries drawn from a diagram that had never been legally verified. For the first time, the scale of the mistake became clear. This wasn't a dispute over interpretation. The project had been built on an assumption, one that only existed because no one confirmed the owner's consent before construction began. And assumptions, once built into concrete, rarely stayed small problems for long. Daniel didn't contact a private attorney first. Instead, he opened a different folder, one he hadn't touched since returning home. At the bottom of his father's records sat a thin envelope stamped with a faded federal emblem. He remembered it vaguely from years earlier, something his father kept separate from the county paperwork and never explained in detail. Inside was a survey control diagram. Not a property survey. A reference survey. Coordinates marked in a format Daniel recognized immediately, military geodetic notation used for long-term monitoring points. The drawing referenced a flood mitigation study performed decades earlier along the creek corridor after seasonal overflow threatened downstream infrastructure. His father hadn't owned the study. He'd hosted it. The Army Corps of Engineers had installed a permanent control marker on the property, the same iron pin beside the park entrance, used to track soil movement and water channel stability over time. Daniel drove back to the site and knelt beside the marker again. He brushed the concrete base clean. The stamped cap carried a faint identification number almost hidden by oxidation. He photographed it and sent the image through a contact in his core mapping unit, not asking for intervention, only verification. The reply came that afternoon. The marker still existed in the federal monitoring database. Active status. Protected reference point. He read the description carefully. Disturbance or grade alteration within monitoring radius requires federal review. Daniel looked toward the playground footings anchored only yards away. then toward the trench redirecting runoff along the creek bank, then toward the lighting posts buried deep into reshaped soil. The issue had never only been ownership. It was jurisdiction. Local property disputes were handled in civil court. But altering terrain inside a recorded hydrological monitoring corridor triggered regulatory oversight beyond the HOA, beyond the county, and beyond private negotiation. Daniel didn't confront the board. He didn't threaten them. He filled out a site disturbance notification, the same administrative process used when contractors accidentally affected protected survey infrastructure. The form didn't accuse. It requested inspection. Within 2 days, an acknowledgement arrived confirming a joint review with regional engineers and environmental compliance staff. The HOA still operated normally. They scheduled weekend events, installed additional landscaping near the entrance sign, posted online about final improvements nearing completion. Caroline Pike even sent Daniel another letter, firmer this time, warning that continued documentation around the park could constitute harassment and result in escalating fines. He filed it under correspondence and said nothing. The inspection notice wasn't public. No one in the neighborhood knew it existed. On the morning of the review, Daniel arrived early and waited near the road rather than the gate. A county zoning vehicle pulled in first, followed by a state environmental truck. Minutes later, a third vehicle arrived, plain, unmarked except for a small federal seal on the door. Residents assumed it was part of the ongoing disagreement. Some gathered nearby expecting a boundary argument. Caroline approached confidently with a binder in hand. She greeted the officials, explaining the association had resolved a private property confusion and simply needed confirmation to silence complaints. Daniel remained quiet. The engineers didn't begin by asking about ownership. They asked about grading permits, about excavation depth, about drainage redirection. They measured the distance from the iron marker outward, establishing a radius with survey equipment far more precise than the HOA's contractors had used. One of them read the control ID aloud and checked it against the tablet. He then explained calmly, to no one in particular, that the marker formed part of a long-term federal hydrology reference network. Any alteration to soil composition or water flow within its monitoring perimeter required prior review to prevent downstream impact. Caroline's expression shifted slightly. She opened her binder to the planning meeting minutes and handed them over as proof of approval. The engineer read a page, then handed it back. "This authorizes a conceptual layout," he said evenly. "It does not authorize ground disturbance in a monitored corridor." A small crowd had gathered by then, drawn by the unfamiliar equipment and the quiet seriousness of the conversation. Daniel spoke only once. He explained where the original creek bank sat before excavation and pointed out the redirection trench now funneling runoff toward the monitored bend. His tone was clinical, descriptive, not accusatory, the same way he would brief a terrain change overseas. The officials continued measuring for nearly an hour. They photographed each installation point, playground anchors, lighting poles, drainage cut, soil compaction around the walking path. No one raised their voice. No dramatic confrontation occurred. But the atmosphere changed. The discussion was no longer about whether Daniel owned the land. It was about work performed in a location where permission required a different authority entirely, one the HOA had never contacted because they never knew it existed. Caroline asked what the next step would be. The engineer answered plainly. A formal determination would be issued after review. Until then, no additional modifications were to occur. Daniel packed his documents back into the tube without speaking further. The residents slowly dispersed, uncertain what they had just witnessed. The board still believed it was a complicated technical delay, something paperwork could correct. But Daniel understood something they didn't yet. Property disputes could be negotiated. Regulatory violations followed procedures. And procedures, once triggered, didn't depend on opinion, popularity, or neighborhood votes. They depended only on what had already been done. The hearing wasn't scheduled at a courthouse. It was held in the county administration meeting room, the same place the HOA had once presented its park concept months earlier. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly, many occupied by residents expecting a boundary disagreement finally reaching a conclusion. Instead, 3 different agencies sat at the front table: County Zoning, State Environmental Compliance, and a regional representative from the Army Corps of Engineers. Daniel arrived early and chose a seat along the side wall, not at the front. He carried only a thin folder and the survey tube. No attorney beside him, no visible preparation beyond documentation. Caroline Pike entered confidently with 2 board members and a legal representative. The table held binders, printed meeting minutes, and photos of the park filled with families, evidence, they believed, of community benefit. The zoning officer opened the session calmly. This is a review regarding construction performed on Parcel 18B and associated environmental and jurisdictional concerns. Caroline spoke first. She described unused land, resident support, and planning committee approval. She emphasized good faith, that the association believed the area was intended green space connected to subdivision expansion. Her attorney added that the owner never actively maintained the land and that the HOA relied on public records available at the time. Then the Corps representative asked a simple question. Did the association verify the survey control marker located within the construction area prior to ground disturbance? Caroline hesitated briefly. We relied on planning approval and county records. The representative nodded and placed a printed map onto the display screen. It showed overlapping layers, property boundaries, watershed flow mapping, and a small circular zone centered on a coordinate point. He explained the marker installed decades earlier was part of a hydrological monitoring network used to track erosion patterns affecting downstream infrastructure. Any grading, anchoring, or water redirection within its radius required pre-construction review. Silence spread through the room. The HOA attorney leaned forward. The association was never informed of federal jurisdiction on this parcel. The Corps representative answered evenly. Jurisdiction exists regardless of awareness. Notice is not required before responsibility. He then listed the documented alterations. Excavation for playground footings. Soil compaction from path installation. Drainage redirection trench. Permanent lighting anchors. Each fell inside the monitored zone. The zoning officer then asked Daniel to present his documentation. He stood, placed the survey tube on the table, and unrolled the stamped boundary survey beside the federal reference diagram. He didn't accuse anyone. He only explained the sequence. When he returned, what records showed, what permits did not exist. His tone remained steady, closer to a technical briefing than testimony. A resident raised a hand from the audience. So, the park was never approved? The zoning officer clarified carefully, local planning approval covered design suitability only, contingent on legal ownership and external compliance, neither of which had been completed. Caroline's confidence finally faltered. She flipped through her binder searching for language that wasn't there. Her attorney shifted direction, suggesting a retroactive compliance process might resolve the issue. The environmental officer spoke for the first time. Retroactive review applies only when initial authorization exists. In this case, no agency with jurisdiction was contacted before soil alteration. Another resident asked whether the park could remain open during review. The Corps representative answered calmly. Use must cease until determination. The area may require restoration depending on impact assessment. Murmurs spread across the chairs. Not anger, realization. Daniel remained standing only long enough to answer direct questions. He didn't request penalties. He didn't ask for removal. Each time he spoke, it was to clarify measurements, dates, or documentation. The zoning officer summarized the situation. The association acted under assumption of ownership. Construction proceeded without confirmed authority. Work occurred inside a regulated monitoring corridor. The review board recessed briefly to finalize administrative steps. When they returned, the officer read the immediate order. The park would close pending formal determination. No additional activity permitted. Barrier notice to be posted within 24 hours. The HOA attorney requested reconsideration citing community reliance. The officer shook his head gently. Reliance cannot override jurisdictional compliance. Caroline sat back slowly, absorbing the shift. What had begun as a disagreement between neighbors now stood as a multi-agency enforcement matter. Outside the building, residents gathered in small groups, trying to process what they had heard. Some approached Daniel quietly, not confrontational now, but curious. He answered politely, simply repeating that records existed long before the construction. No celebration followed. No dramatic exit. Just a quiet understanding spreading that the outcome would no longer depend on debate or opinion, only on the findings the agencies would issue next. For the first time since the park appeared, the decision had moved completely out of the neighborhood's hands. The determination letter arrived 3 weeks later. It came by certified mail to both Daniel and the Willow Creek HOA, but word spread through the neighborhood long before anyone opened the envelopes. A notice had already been posted on the park gate, a white placard replacing the bright welcome sign. Area closed, pending compliance order. Daniel waited until evening before reading the document at his kitchen table. The language was technical, methodical, and unmistakably final. The review confirmed measurable alteration to a monitored hydrological reference corridor and unauthorized construction on privately recorded land. The grading work had redirected runoff patterns enough to affect the downstream measurement baseline. The installations weren't simply misplaced, they invalidated data the corridor was meant to track. Because of that, correction wasn't optional. The order required the HOA to remove all permanent structures within the designated radius, restore original soil contours under supervision, re-establish drainage patterns matching prior survey benchmarks, cover costs for environmental monitoring during recovery, compensate the property owner for land use and disturbance. Additionally, the association faced civil penalties issued through state compliance channels, not criminal, but significant enough that their insurance carrier would be notified automatically. The letter never used the word punishment. Only restoration and liability. 2 days later, contractors returned, not the original builders, but a remediation company. They arrived with survey flags, erosion blankets, and equipment designed to undo rather than create. Residents watched quietly as the playground posts were unbolted from concrete footings cut out section by section. The rubber walking surface peeled back in long strips revealing compacted soil beneath. The drainage trench was filled and reshaped under direction of an engineer referencing the older surveyed elevations Daniel had provided. Caroline Pike stood nearby during much of the first morning, speaking occasionally with the compliance supervisor. Her posture was no longer authoritative, just attentive, taking notes as instructions were explained. At one point she approached Daniel where he stood at the road's edge. "We honestly believed the approval covered everything," she said carefully. Daniel answered without accusation. "It covered the idea. Not the ground." She nodded once, accepting the distinction, and returned to the crew. Over the following week the park disappeared piece by piece. Without the bright equipment and fencing, the space looked unfamiliar to newer residents, just uneven earth settling back toward the creek's natural curve. Seed blankets replaced turf. Temporary barriers protected the recovering bank. No one argued anymore. The HOA board announced a special meeting to restructure procedures for future projects, citing compliance failures. Their attorney handled communications going forward. Notices became precise and cautious. Daniel received a separate document confirming compensation for land use and confirming that the parcel retained its original classification with additional protection noted in county records referencing the monitoring corridor. No victory speech followed. No apology demanded. Only signatures acknowledging correction. The final inspection occurred at sunrise nearly a month after the closure. Officials measured elevations and water flow after a light rain the night before. The creek followed its earlier channel again, slower and closer to the line Daniel remembered from childhood. The engineer marked the report satisfactory. With that, enforcement ended. Not because anyone argued harder. Because the records had finally been allowed to matter. By early spring the ground had settled. Fresh grass replaced the seed blankets, growing uneven at first but slowly blending into the older vegetation along the creek bank. Without the fencing and bright equipment, the land looked quieter than Daniel remembered, not empty, just returned to its natural purpose. Neighbors still walked the edge path that had formed over time, but now they paused at the small post Daniel installed near the original survey marker. No warnings. Just a simple metal plaque. Private property, please respect the boundary. People did. Not out of fear of enforcement, but out of understanding. The months of confusion had changed how the neighborhood viewed the space. It wasn't unused land anymore. It was someone's responsibility, preserved through patience rather than argument. At a later HOA meeting, one Daniel attended briefly, new procedures were announced. Any future improvement would require verified ownership documentation and external compliance checks before discussion even began. No one objected. On quiet evenings Daniel sometimes stood near the creek listening to the water settle against the rock his father once placed there by hand. The sounds were familiar again, steady, predictable, undisturbed. He capped the old survey marker with a fresh protective cover and pressed it firmly into place. Not to keep people out, but to remind anyone who noticed it that boundaries exist long before conflicts do, and respect works best when it arrives before the mistake, not after the correction.